Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our office hour series and today's event or today's session of Writing to Win, How Strong Teams Set Writers Up for Success. So today is not really a session about better writing. It's about everything that happens before, the first sentence gets written. Because when a first draft comes back, either generic, unfocused, or difficult to review, the instinct is often to look at the writer and kind of what they put in. But a lot of what determines the quality of that draft was decided before, that writer even opened up the document. So today I want to look at what strong teams are giving writers before starting drafts, how that can change the review process, and where technology, of course, can make that a bit more consistent. And rather talk about this only in theory, I want to make sure with all of these sessions, I try to make sure that we follow an example and I give you some actionable takeaways. So today we're going to follow one section from kind of a week assignment all the way through a draft that is of higher quality. So before I jump in here, I want to, of course, welcome everybody. If you've come to our sessions or registered for our sessions before, welcome back. If you are new, welcome for the first time. So we have these office hour sessions every other Thursday. We have a mix of topics. We talk about process, we talk about technology, we talk about the industry, and of course, we talk about visible thread at times. But try to, with every session, give you information that you can take away, apply, and help to improve or optimize your processes. So coming up, just to give you a preview, our next session, and I'm sorry I skipped over this, sorry, it's every other Thursday, 30 minutes. We have live Q&A and always free replays after. You will get the slides, you will get a recording as well. Just as a preview, inside our Visible Thread 7.3 will be our next session in 2 weeks. So we have a big release coming up for the platform, and we're going to do a bit of a dive into ownership, task workflows, new dashboards, and some of the collaborative elements of that, because there's some really exciting things there. After that, we're talking about value from review gates, talking about habits, workflows of teams whose reviews are really working for them, and then building compliance and clarity into the first draft. So they're really talking about moving compliance, clarity, and consistency checks into the first draft, and talking about how we can, improve on that line. We'll also be doing some product showcases. We're going to do one today. So in every session, we have a 5-minute video. Today's is less than 4 minutes, 3.5 minutes, highlighting a feature that's being promoted for the upcoming release. So just to give you a little sneak peek of what we're up to. So all that being said, would love to connect on LinkedIn. You can register for the series if you haven't, and we would love to see you back. So jumping into today's topic. So the argument that we're making here is kind of the entire crux of the session. So in this series, I cover a lot of different topics, but it often circles back to process. So that could include, workflow changes, repeatability, consistency, and on and on and on. But ultimately, we're talking about how setting up folks downstream for success and creating a feedback and review loop that really works will ultimately benefit you long term. So let's talk about how this shows up relative to today's conversation. So in this scenario, say a writer gets a thin assignment. The draft comes back generic, which is honestly the predictable outcome there. And then a group of people get into a review and start asking, where's the strategy? Where's the evidence? Why didn't we say this? Why didn't we structure it this way? And somehow at the end of all of that, oftentimes some of that falls back onto the writer. But if the writer never had the strategy, the evidence, and didn't know what the section was supposed to prove, we're asking the draft really then to solve problems that should have been solved upstream. So this is why I think the first draft quality is better reviewed as a process outcome, not simply a writing outcome. And that's what we're going to dive into. So what we're going to do is look at 5 things. First, what the writer actually needs before drafting. Second, which standards are worth settling before the review starts. So what do we need to do before that happens? Third, how we get that guidance to the contributor when they actually need it. So how are we communicating this effectively? How are we making sure that that information is up to date and helpful? And then we'll separate kind of deterministic work, AI assisted work, and work that still depends heavily on human judgment. Just have a slide on that to talk about where we ideally can optimize and automate and where we need to kind of fall back to our human judgment. And then I want to give you a very small version, not some huge kind of process overhaul, but just a very small version of some things that you can try on the next proposal without, rolling out a big process change. So some things that maybe can help today. And so one kind of caveat I want to give before we dive in is that this is a recommended kind of model, not the only way to run a bid. So your organization may use different artifacts, review gates, role names, and that's fine. The decisions that we're making here, which is what we'll focus on, matter more than the labels, but I have done some like red team, pink team labeling. So if that doesn't represent your process exactly, think about the kind of decisions we're making within to make it more actionable. Okay. So this is a cycle I think that most proposal teams will recognize. So the assignment comes in thin, outline number, page count, and a due date. And the writer then is going to have to fill the missing context with reusable content usually. That's usually the safest starting point. That's the information that's available. Then when that happens, your review kind of becomes a discovery. So the reviewers at that point start supplying strategy, standards, missing evidence, and sometimes even solutioning. So one comment at a time, working through this process. Then the section gets rewritten and you're pushing up against deadlines. So a lot of times the foundational work is the reason that we're struggling at the end. So the problem is not that the review happened, like the review of course should happen, but the problem is the review becomes the first place where people are clearly stating what good is supposed to look like. So if we move more of that information to the beginning, the review conversation changes. We stop using the review to give the assignment and start using it to test the argument that we are creating. Now, before we kind of get into the process, I want to acknowledge reality. Of course, the target model is going to look very clean. So capture hands over customer intelligence, proposal manager builds compliance structure, volume lead defines the argument, SMEs provide evidence, the writer writes, reviewers evaluate, everything is wonderful, harmonious. That's the kind of PowerPoint version of proposal development. And I understand all the folks in the room have different processes and different challenges. So the actual bid may look a lot more like the right-hand side. So RFP is dropping, everyone's scrambling, compliance matrix exists somewhere, SMEs get assigned, writers begin discovering the solution while they're drafting, capturing strategy exists, but it might not be in front of the right people at the right time, that there are a lot of moving pieces, and completely acknowledge that. We look at, pink team then becoming solution development and red team becoming rewriting. So the session's really about these two columns and the space between. So I'm not assuming that you already run the left-hand side perfectly, or even saying that that's exactly what has to happen for you to be successful. The question is, can we change small things and improve our process incrementally on the next bid? So can we make progress? Not everything needs to be perfect, because I understand there are a myriad of dependencies here. So ultimately, if we're talking about that gap, so underneath that, the kind of space between area and what our today process might look like, we see kind of three common themes, or that's what I see most often when I'm working with customers. The first is context. So the writer doesn't know what the customer cares about, how the section is being evaluated, or what the section needs to prove. So that's very different than what needs to be done. So this is the solution that we need to discuss. This is exactly what we're doing here. But they don't have the context of why the customer actually cares, what is the real kind of crux of how we're being evaluated and what's most important, and what are we trying to prove? So what is the end goal? The second is standard. So things like terminology, readability, tone, and claims are being decided during the review rather than before it. And of course, depending on your tools, there are parts of that that you can automate, but we need to keep that in mind no matter how we're approaching that, whether we are implementing a tool to work with that process. In that case, you're thinking about making sure that you have governance in place, everything is up to date, the information that's being sourced is being accurate. If this is manual, it is where does this information exist? How do people access it? And how do we make sure that we are creating a scenario where they have what they need when they need it? Thirdly is execution. So the guidance may exist, but it's not in front of the contributor. So that kind of ties into that second point is how do we get what we need when we need it and make sure that we are communicating effectively. So those are the three kind of main problems that we're going to work through over the next several slides. Now, let's make this concrete. I want to follow kind of one fictional section and stick with me on my example. I know it might not be representative for everybody, but it is a pretty generic example just so we can walk through the general ideas. So I want to walk through the fictional section, which will be a section 3.2 transition or an infrastructure operations recompete on an infrastructure, sorry. It's been a long week. I don't know. Okay, so let's talk about the assignment as the writer receives it. So you have, this is your assignment. You have 3.2 transition, it's 6 pages, draft is due the 14th, pull from the last task order response. That's not unusual. That's a general kind of, this is what you need to do. But look at how many decisions the writer now has to make before kind of moving forward and to shape the content they're creating. So it's how is the transition being scored? You know, which requirements belong in the section? What are we actually claiming? What evidence do we have? What can we say about, you know, incumbent risk? And if none of that is available, what does the writer do? They open the last proposal. Now they're adapting an old description instead of building an argument for this customer. So often when we are using boilerplate or we're transitioning themes or delivery items from previous proposals, that becomes kind of an updated version of potentially an old approach. Maybe it's not our best, sort of our best stab at it. So ultimately, they're going to go through this process, but the draft is going to come back describing a transition rather than providing why this transition is the lower risk choice. So we're not getting to the why, which is the really important part. And then pink team is going to become a strategy conversation. So if we want a simple way to diagnose whether an assignment is ready, you know, we want to ask how much does the writer have to invent before they start? I'll make this correlation a couple times. Think about this as you are thinking about the way that you communicate with LLMs. Our folks that are using LLMs and creating generated content, there's a ton of thought and training thought into prompt engineering, the context you need to give. We need to think about these things kind of as, you know, 1A and 1B, that you need to make sure that you're giving the appropriate context, structure, all of those ideas. Because what I'm seeing is that folks are putting far more sort of thought and structure and resource material when they are prompting an LLM or a generative system than they are when they are working with a colleague. So I don't want to get too far off track, but that's something that I'll circle back to as well. So thinking about that, sorry about that. I had a little slow down there. So when I talk about everything the writer needs to know, so when I say the section brief here, I'm saying your organization may call it, you know, a storyboard, annotated outline, writer package, content plan, section plan. The name isn't necessarily important here, rather what it must convey. So whatever you are giving the writer, however you are translating that information to them, they need 6 things. So maybe more, maybe less, but generally this is what we're looking at. So how is this section scored? What must it contain? The message or discriminator it needs to prove. So what is the point of the section? What proof do we have available and what proof points are we using? The expected shape of the response. So what are we thinking about from a structural perspective? What are we thinking about from a allocation, heading structure? Are we using graphics? What is the expectation of our, final proof look like? And then the limits. So are there claims we can't make? Are there things that belong somewhere else? Are there specific items that we don't want to bring up in this specific area? So this doesn't have to become another giant template. I don't want to see this going down that road. It really, one page can be useful constraint. It doesn't have to be a rule written in stone. It's just think back about whatever you call it, whatever that structure looks like. This is the kind of foundation of the information you need to get to a much better kind of first draft and a better kind of starting point. So the point here is not to turn good writers into kind of transcription machines. It's not, okay, we're going to give you all of the information. I want you to take everything here, no creativity, and kind of spit it back out. So senior writers, of course, should absolutely help shape the structure and sharpen the argument and be part of that situation here. And nothing that I've given here has firm guidelines on how they need to present this. It just gets everybody on the same page and removes some of that avoidable guessing. So thinking about that, let's look at what happens when we kind of attach those sections. So let's work this through. Say that I am working on this 3.2 transition, but I've been briefed. And so this is the same assignment I've been given, but I have some of the decisions in that context attached. So here I will know exactly what section M is scoring, minimizing risk to continuity of operations during transition. So that's exactly what's being scored here. We know the section L requirements that belong here. We know our arguments. So our argument in this case would be that our phase cutover reduces transition risk because no single event can interrupt operations. Great. We have proof. 42 migrated services with 0 unplanned outages on a comparable contract, And we know the structure and the graphic, we know the boundaries. So this is a completely different starting point than just, this is the section, this is what I want you to transition from or reference from, this is the due date, this is the length. So what we're talking about here is that the source material or providing the source material is going to get you to a much more actionable draft or much more actionable piece of content. Now, an important thing, some of this information may or likely already exist somewhere on the team. Some of it may not, and that's actually very useful. Some teams may have a very mature process built out where they have all of this information in one place and it's easily accessible. However, that if we don't, or if we're finding areas where I don't have this specific information to share, that isn't something that's been fleshed out. So if I can't fill in the proof section, I found an evidence gap. If I can't state a message, I found a strategy gap. If I don't know how we're going to approach a requirement, I may have found a solution gap. So the section brief is not only a handoff to the writer, it's also kind of a readiness diagnostic, because if we can't answer those kind of 6 important questions, the section may not be ready to draft and we may need to work on our approach a bit more. Now, the next question is always, of course, who is supposed to provide all of this? Who is doing this? And the answer, of course, is going to change by organization, but the dependencies are going to be fairly consistent. So customer intelligence always comes first, then compliance and response structure, then the kind of section level argument, then our proof. So the calendar there may be completely different depending on the pursuit. A recompete within a year of capture may work through this over weeks. A 10-day task order, a 10-day task order or something shorter may do it in one afternoon. A 5-day response with a multitude of contributors could make that brief even smaller. So the shorter the window, the more important it is to focus on the decisions that prevent rework. And we'll talk about rework about a bit in the end when we think about assessing our progress, but rework is a very important part of this conversation. And so this isn't an argument for more process. I'm not coming on here and telling you yet again that you need to rework a process. It's just making the important decisions in the right order to make sure that we're getting the best result. So I want to also acknowledge the fact that this looks very different depending on your team size. So for a small business, one person may be wearing all of these hats. They may be BD, capture, proposal manager, and writer doing the whole thing themselves. So you don't need, 4 separate people. We just need to think of the decisions that we're making, because regardless of if it's one person or it's 20 or 30 people, the decisions that we need and the information that we need stays the same. So 5 bullets may be enough. What are they scoring? What must we say? What's our proof? What is different about us? What can't we forget when we're creating this content? For a mid-sized organization, the challenge is often those inconsistent handoffs, or at least that's what I'm seeing most often. So we have some specialization, we have some process around this, but it varies depending on who's running the bid, depending on the size, depending on the level of importance, all of those types of things. So that's where that standard brief and standard review criteria, can make a big difference. So there, if we get those standards in place, that can make a big difference regardless of who's involved or the level of effort. And then at large enterprises, that process may already exist. These things may already be in place. You likely already have, storyboards, working compliance matrices, style guides, color teams, established practices, a checked and rechecked process. But the problem then becomes execution at scale. So the question isn't, do we have guidance? It's, can we get the right guidance to 50 different contributors consistently? So does everybody have access to the same information, and are they telling the same story? So I outline that difference because the underlying information is universal, but the challenges can be unique. And I want you to think about what needs to be conveyed rather than the kind of nuances of your process, because ultimately the end goal is the same. Now, talking about that example, we want to talk about the standards, talk about the brief. So the brief handles the bid specific context. Now let's look at the standards there and understand why they shouldn't have to be reinvented on every section. And this is something that we can work through pretty efficiently. So there are a few things worth deciding before review. Readability, terminology, tone and claims, and where it's useful, a common section pattern. Again, dependent on the type of opportunity or the spread of your opportunities. So if we know an agency uses specific vocabulary, decide that once. If we have an acronym convention, decide it once. If unsupported claims are not acceptable, make that clear before the writer drafts them. For measurable things like sentence length or passive voice, you can use numeric signals, but I want to be careful here. These are, and this chart is, diagnostics, not definitions of good writing. So a complex engineering response, of course, should not read exactly like an executive summary. And so the goal is not to give the prose a score and declare it good per se. It's to identify areas that deserve a closer look before a reviewer has to find them manually. So I talk a lot about how to best communicate with LLMs when creating content. And I said that in the front end. And I think those structures are helpful to use here. So make sure that you're being as clear and structured as you would for one for the other. So if I were to prompt an engine to create this content, I would likely pay more attention to my instructions and context content. So take a similar approach here as well. And that also helps for development on both sides. So looking at the kind of brief and our standards change. So same writer with and without the context. Our first paragraph says, our team brings extensive experience in complex IT transitions and is fully committed to a seamless best-in-class transition, on and on and on. So we have all read versions of this sentence and the type of reviews that it attracts. So, what criteria is this answering? What does extensive mean? Are we doing phase cutover or not? Where's the evidence? All of those things are going to be a question because we've given very generic information. Now look at the second paragraph. So here we're saying we move services one group at a time, so no single event can interrupt operations. On a comparable logistics agency contract, this phase cutover migrated 42 services with 0 unplanned outages. Now, the review questions are going to change. Is the past performance comparable enough? Can we substantiate the metric? Would the rollback point be stronger in the graphic? Are we pushing the risk argument hard enough? That's a much better review, and those are much more substantial questions that source a substantial conversation. So same writer, same deadline. The difference is the second review is about whether the argument wins. The first review is still just trying to figure out what the argument is and what direction we should be heading. So think about this as acting like an evaluator, not an editorial committee. So this leads to kind of that idea in a structured way. So if we're running red team, we need to think about it that direction. So whatever your organization calls these gates, the principle is the same. So reviewers should be asking, did we answer what was requested? Um, would I score this highly if I were reviewing it at this point? Can I see why the approach works? Do I believe the evidence? Have we assessed risk? So can I find answers quickly? All those types of things. Sorry, I'm going down a rabbit hole. But scarce review time shouldn't be spent debating customer versus client, acronym conventions, house terminology, or whether you like a certain approach better. So we should settle those things already. And reviewers aren't the problem here. It isn't the way that they're reviewing or the way that they're pulling in content. It is that unstated review scope. So finally, how do we get guidance to the contributor effectively? So far, everything that we've talked about assumes the writer can actually see the guidance. So that kind of assumption is where a lot of mature processes break because we are assuming things that aren't happening in practice. So I want you to think about the number of steps between the sentence being written and the guidance that applies to it. So if I don't have the information there, I need to leave the document, find the style guide, work out which version is current, find the relevant section, then go back to writing my piece of content. So under every deadline, all of those steps are opportunities to say, I'll fix it later, or, after things slow down, we need to take a look at these systems and processes, and we need to do some work here to make this more efficient. And how often does that really happen before we have another fire that we have to put out? So at scale, that becomes much harder. At volume, that becomes much harder. So for a small team, this may be a folder problem. And for an enterprise, it can be a big distribution problem. So either way, the outcome's the same. The guidance exists, but it's not consistently working to change what gets written. So this is where technology can become really relevant. So I think automated versus manual is kind of too direct or too minimized a way to think about proposal work now. So there's really kind of three categories. So we have our categories of automated work, and then we have our human element. So first, deterministic work. So there we're talking about requirement identification, document comparison, terminology, acronyms, readability, prohibited language. Those are areas where repeatability and auditability are really going to matter. So second, AI assigned work. So this is summarization, reviewing content, first pass analysis, drafting support, synthesizing SME input. AI can get us to a starting point much faster, but someone still needs to be accountable for what it produced. And that's the human judgment piece of it. So strategy, differentiation, whether the proof is credible, customer understanding and reflecting of their real underlying needs, risk trade-offs, what are we willing to claim? What are we willing to put on the table here? So AI can absolutely help surface possibilities and poke holes in your approach, but a person still needs to own the decision. You still need to own that piece of the puzzle. So that distinction matters because we should be using technology to protect human time for the work that actually changes the score, the stuff that really matters. So think about the chain here. So if we apply that thinking to our pre-drafting chain, you can see where that weight shifts a bit. So tracing requirements in the front end, requirement extraction first, that's going to be really automation heavy, but tracing requirements into the response structure is mixed because you really need to still have interpretation there. Setting the argument is judgment heavy. Publishing standards is automation heavy. Checking the draft against those standards is also automation. And amendments are great tests of this distinction. So an amendment may technically change a requirement, but sometimes that change also affects strategy. So the first can be detected by software, but the second requires a conversation. So it's really thinking about your tech stack, your mix, how they're applied and how they can do the most for you, and where you need to have human judgment involved, where the systems can take part of that. And with the overall goal being, at the end of the day, I want to use my human judgment, use that piece of the puzzle in a much more meaningful way. So get through a couple things quickly. We have our little video, and we're going to go a bit over today because I do have a little video to show you. If you can hang on, that would be awesome. So I want to start here because I promise I'm not asking for some big change. So just a few things that we could do. So first, tell every writer how their section's evaluated. So you don't need a new tool for that. Just a couple sentences and a transition instruction is a good start. Second, give them the message the section has to prove and the evidence behind it. So they need to understand the why and understand what the deliverable actually looks like. And third, tell reviewers what they're actually reviewing so they understand, what's in scope, what's already been settled. And those changes, so these small pieces of the puzzle, are going to move a lot of discovery out of the news cycle. So no major process, really just better inputs. Then I'll get through this one, and then I promise I'll show you the video. And this is kind of the mature process checklist. So the fuller version, and like I said, you're going to get copies of this. This is where you're headed. So ultimately, a written brief is the ideal. So somewhere where they're going to see section M criteria, section L requirements, clear messaging, evidence, published standards, clear review scope, automated checks where we're measurable, and guidance that reaches a contributor where they're working. So ultimately, this is the direction that you'd like to go. And so that's kind of the place to start. And really think about this, because with so many orgs now adopting automation, we're in a bit of a season of change from a process and approach perspective. So use that to your advantage to set new standards here. So finally, and I'm so sorry, when I uploaded this, it kind of made my slide get a little bit funky. So finally, how do we know if this actually helped? So we don't want to just count review comments or times, because fewer comments isn't necessarily better. So 10 strategic comments can be more value than 50 little nitpick ones. So we want to look at the type of rework. Again, similar to using tech, focusing on the level of rework needed and why. So what information did we omit, and could providing additional context or framing have improved the draft? So we want to tag and classify comments as, this is missing information, this is compliance, this is a strategy issue, this is evidence, this is a structure, style, et cetera, et cetera. And then look at how that mix changes. So if missing information and compliance comments fall, that tells you the process is doing more work before review. If strategy and evidence comments rise, that actually could be a good thing. It means your reviewers have time to focus on questions that can improve the score. And there's a nice kind of before and after diagnostic there. So before drafting, the section brief tells you when you're not ready. After drafting, the review comments tell you what the process kind of still failed to solve and where you have the opportunity to do a little bit more work. Okay. So where I kind of want to say from a takeaway and where we'll land is, before we land the draft, look at the input. So make sure that the writer has the correct context to make sure that you're getting the information that you're looking for. So the more context, the more evidence, the more decisions we can move upstream, the more valuable that review process becomes. And like I said, depends on your size. So for a small team, this might be those 5 bullets we talked about. For a larger team, it might mean standardizing handoffs. And for enterprise, it may be making sure the process you have is really reaching every contributor. But ultimately, the same decisions need to be made. Okay, so like I said, I have just a 3-minute video on a visible thread feature coming in our 7.3 launch. And I do have a couple questions. I know we're over, so I will likely respond after. I have a question about the presentation. Absolutely, you'll get that after. And then I have a second question that I know we're over time, so I will follow up with you after on that, because I do have an answer. Okay, so here we are going to look at the cover this is going to be, excuse me, I'm rushing to get through the end. We're covering stage gate transition. So this can be helpful to reinforce process, set standards for processing an opportunity, and it'll show you some of the gates and the sections that we have as we're working through building up the new platform. Like I said, I will jump back after that and we will finish up. And this is just a few minutes. So let's go ahead and get started.
Your company's capture or proposal process is usually written down somewhere. Whether it was followed usually is not. Every time an opportunity or a proposal moves to the next stage, someone made a call, and there's rarely a record of what they checked before they made it. And with that, I introduce stage gates in Visible Thread. Before any opportunity or proposal moves forward, the reviewer answers the questions you set for that transition. Before we look into this a little bit deeper, let's see how it is set up. Let's go to the settings page and to pipeline stages. You are not tied to a fixed set of questions. You have full control over the stages in your own capture and proposal process. For example, I can set the stage names and the color for each stage. More importantly, I can set the questions I want reviewers to answer before they can move to the next stage. You can reorder these questions or reorder the stages as you wish. Before we save these edits, I'm going to talk about the 3 gate types that you can apply. The first is soft gate, the flexible option. Reviewers can skip the questions you've set for that stage and optionally add a note explaining why they've made that decision. The second is hard gate, the strictest of the 3. An opportunity or a proposal cannot advance until every question you have set has been answered. And finally, no gate. Opportunities and proposals move freely with no questions at all. You can set a different gate for tracked opportunities and proposals. So in this case, I'm going to use soft gate for tracked opportunities, and I'll use hard gate for proposals. Let's look back at the tracked opportunities board to see this in action. I have a number of opportunities here at different stages of the capture lifecycle. When I move one opportunity to the next stage, the dialog appears with the questions we just set in settings. We just added this question: who is the capture lead? Because this board is on soft gate, I have the option to skip the questions and add an optional note. Once I've made my selections, I can click Move to Qualifying. This moves my opportunity to the next stage. Every answer is logged and kept for audit purposes in the activity log. You can also click the activity icon on any card to see what happened on that opportunity, including how each reviewer answered stage gate questions. I'm also going to show another icon, which is at the top of the board at each stage. If you click this, you'll be able to see the questions that you as a reviewer need to be able to answer to proceed past this stage. And let's move to the proposals board and just see how that works in the hard gate option. So if I move NBIS strategic support proposal to the red team review, I have some questions to answer. As this is in a hard gate mode, the reviewer cannot skip anything. Every question has to be answered. And that is stage gates. It lets you enforce your own process, and it gives you an audit log of who did what and when. Thank you.
Excellent. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for staying a few minutes over. I'll say one thing about stage gates. So an excellent way to reinforce some of the things that we talked about today. So if there are specific draft or specific items that must happen or are in selecting and putting together our brief or handing this brief over to writers when we're moving to the writing process through our stages, that's something that we can reinforce there as well. And that was the reason that I kind of brought that in as an example. So again, thank you everybody for joining us today. You will be getting the recording as well as the deck here. So you'll have all of that information. Like I said, please, would love to have you register for the series if you haven't already. Our next session will be talking about 7.3. Some really exciting things happening there with the next release, including a lot of great items around task assignment, collaboration, the way that we can do reviews more effectively within the platform, and all of the other things that we can do just for collaboration and visibility across the entire proposal lifecycle. So we hope to see you there. I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of the day and weekend. And thank you for hanging in there with me for some extra time and my little bit of a crazy Thursday. So again, good to see everybody. Have a great rest of your week and great rest of your day. Bye.